When 24-year-old Amelia Amy Turner set off alone into the Grand Teton wilderness, she expected 4 days of peace, photography, and personal discovery. Instead, she vanished without a trace. Her backpack was packed with care, her gear was flawless, her plans were known. But somewhere along that breathtaking route through paintbrush and Cascade Canyons, she stepped into the silence of the mountains and never came back. Each weekend after her father combed those jagged valleys and towering ridgelines, refusing to accept the word gone. Search parties followed the scant evidence, combing through pine forests and glacier-fed ravines, but found only the echo of her footsteps and the whisper of wind through the alpine trees. The trail had gone cold. For nearly a year, her disappearance defied explanation, until a chance sighting by a wildlife ranger while studying golden eagles led to a terrifying discovery on a cliffside ledge that would unravel everything. The Grand Tetons are not mountains that gently introduce themselves. They burst from the valley floor of Jackson Hole like a jagged exclamation, raw and immediate, with no foothills to ease the transition. Ancient slabs of stone carved by ice and time, they rise abruptly into the sky, indifferent, imposing, and spectacularly wild. For centuries, people have come here chasing something: solace, challenge, redemption, or a glimpse of nature's untamed truth. In the summer of 2023, Amy Turner came seeking all of it. She wasn't a thrill seeker, she wasn't reckless, she was a practiced and meticulous hiker. A young artist with a deep respect for the wild. More than that, she was in love with these mountains. Amy had moved to Jackson, Wyoming the year before, trading a promising but unfulfilling future in graphic design for a simpler life at the foot of the range that had fascinated her since childhood. Her tiny apartment above a bookshop was a shrine to the Tetons. Topographic maps tacked to the walls, marked with past and future hikes, and stunning photographs she'd taken herself. A bull moose standing in river mist, the orange blaze of alpenglow on jagged peaks. A wildflower gripping stone where trees no longer grew. Friends described her as quiet, deeply focused, and endlessly prepared. She knew her limits. She understood the weight of solitude. Her love for the backcountry wasn't about adrenaline. It was about reverence. Amy hiked alone because it made her feel alive. Alone, she could list end. To the wind, to her breath, to the shudder of her camera as it caught fleeting moments of perfection. Her most beloved tool was her Nikon D750, worn from use but still sharp. It wasn't just a camera, it was how she shared what she felt. For weeks, she had been planning what she called her most meaningful journey yet, a 4-day, 3-night loop through paintbrush and Cascade Canyons. It was one of the Tetons' most iconic routes, difficult, remote, and breathtaking. This wasn't just a hike to Amy, it was a pilgrimage. A chance to push her skills to their limit, to document an untouched sunrise from the highest ridges, and to build a portfolio for her first gallery show. She had a vision, to capture a sunrise from the Paintbrush Divide, unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Her roommate Kel remembered her obsessing over the plan. Maps were spread across their floor for days. Amy's headlamp would glow long into the night as she traced her route again and again. She wasn't just preparing, Chloe would later say. She was chasing a kind of magic. Her mother, Sarah, shared a video call with her the night before Amy left. In it, Amy was beaming, proudly walking her mom through the gear that lay organized on her apartment floor. Her trusted Osprey pack, her ultralight tent, a weathered cook stove, her down sleeping bag, everything in perfect order. Her food was portioned into neatly labeled Ziplocs. She held up her Garmin satellite messenger and promised daily check-ins. She had backup batteries, 2 water filters, a first aid kit, everything, Sarah said later, tears in her eyes. She was the most prepared person I knew. And that was what made what happened so haunting. Amy wasn't careless. She wasn't lost. She had studied those mountains like scripture. She understood the dangers. Her disappearance wasn't a result of inexperience. It defied logic. At sunrise on Friday, August 12, 2023, Amy drove her silver Subaru to the String Lake trailhead. The morning was crystal clear, one of those Wyoming days where the sky is so blue it seems unreal. The air smelled of pine and damp stone, cool and sweet. As she tightened her pack straps and adjusted her hiking poles, she noticed an elderly couple taking in the view by the water. With a smile, she asked if they'd take a photo of her before she set off. The man, Gerald, a tourist from Ohio, gladly agreed. He would later tell authorities that Amy seemed calm, happy, and confident. The photo he snapped would become the most circulated image of her. In it, Amy stands near the lake, her pink tank top vivid against the green forest behind her. Her camera hangs from a strap around her neck. Her blonde ponytail is pulled back tightly. She holds a hiking pole in one hand. Her backpack looks heavy but well balanced. Behind her, the cathedral group rises like stone cathedrals, silent and eternal. She thanked the couple with a grateful smile and turned toward the trail, her silhouette fading into the trees. That was the last time anyone saw her. Over the next 3 days, no check-ins came from her Garmin. At first, her friends thought maybe she'd lost signal or gotten caught up in the butte and forgotten. But when Monday came and she still hadn't returned, the alarm spread like wildfire. Her roommate filed the report. Rangers sprang into action. Amy's father caught the first flight he could. For weeks, search teams scoured the backcountry. Helicopters flew low along ridges. Dogs sniffed for scent. Volunteers pushed through dense underbrush. They found no broken branches, no scraps of clothing, no gear. Just wilderness. Endless, pristine, and silent. Her father refused to give up. He returned every weekend, hiking alone in the same places she had loved, calling her name into the cold wind. Nearly a year passed with no answers. Then, one morning in early summer, a wildlife ranger studying golden eagle nesting sites spotted something odd through his binoculars. A glint of color on a ledge hundreds of feet above the valley floor. He rappelled down to investigate. What he found on that ledge would tear open the mystery and force authorities to reconsider everything they thought they knew about what happened to Amy Turner. Amy Turner's last known words came through a simple photo text to her mother. She stood by the shimmering edge of String Lake, her silhouette lit with the soft morning sun. The couple who took her photo would later tell rangers that she radiated a kind of peaceful joy, the kind that only comes when a person knows they're exactly where they're meant to be. She told us she was heading into Paintbrush Canyon. Eleanor, the wife, remembered clearly. She said she felt like the luckiest person in the world, to have this beauty practically in her backyard. Moments later, Amy stepped away from the lake's edge, found a quiet place beneath a stand of pines, and sent that photo to her mother with a message that would soon become hauntingly significant. It read, "Off I go, the mountains are calling, the weather is perfect, talk to you Sunday night." With those parting words, she adjusted her shoulder straps, pulled the brim of her hat low, and walked toward the trailhead. The dense wall of lodgepole pines swallowed her form, and like a breath exhaled into the wild, she vanished. One final step into the solitude she so dearly loved. Sunday arrived, and the sun descended behind the Teton Range in a fiery cascade of orange, lavender, and fading gold. In Salt Lake City, Sarah Turner glanced at her phone. It was just past 9 o'clock, and the screen was still dark. No check-in, no "I'm back," no reassuring words from the trail. At first she dismissed it. Maybe the device hadn't charged properly. Maybe Amy had met fellow hikers and decided to extend her trip. There were dozens of reasonable explanations. But Monday brought silence too, and that silence grew heavier by the hour, an oppressive weight pressing on her chest. By nightfall, every logical excuse had dissolved into dread. Sarah's fingers trembled as she dialed Amy's number again and again. Each call answered only by the calm, cheerful voice of her daughter's voicemail greeting. She tried to convince herself it was fine, that Amy would call any minute now, but the gray check marks beside her unread messages stared back like unblinking eyes. By 7:15 p.m. on Monday, unable to deny the gnawing certainty that something was terribly wrong, Sarah called the Teton County Sheriff's Office. Her voice was composed at first, measured, deliberate, but as she spelled out Amy's name and her planned hiking route, her composure crumbled, replaced by a rush of desperation she could no longer contain. Within an hour, the National Park Service was alerted. A ranger was sent to the String Lake trailhead to confirm if Amy's vehicle was still there. By the time the moon rose, pale and ghostly over the granite silhouettes of the Tetons. Amelia Turner had been officially declared missing. Her name was no longer just a daughter's. It had become a subject line in a search and rescue bulletin, a line item in an incident report, a red dot on a map of daunting terrain. The next morning, as the first light of dawn touched the mountaintops, veteran park ranger Tom Albright arrived at the trailhead. His boots crunched softly on the gravel as he approached Amy's silver Subaru. The parking lot was quiet now, eerily so compared to the bustle it had held just days earlier. A thin film of mountain dust and wind-blown pollen coated the windshield, telling him all he needed to know. The car hadn't moved. He peered through the glass. A travel mug, half drained, rested in the cup holder. On the passenger seat sat a neatly folded park map. Everything inside looked ordinary, but it was the ordinariness that struck Albright like a warning bell. Everything was as it should be, except Amy wasn't back. He moved to the metal trail register nearby and flipped through the entries. There it was. Amelia Turner, Paintbrush Cascade Loop, 3 nights, return, Sunday. But no sign out, no exit recorded. In 2 decades of wilderness work, Albright had seen this script before. Most ended with a tired, sunburnt hiker emerging late with stories of unexpected beauty or minor setbacks. But this one was different. Something about it sat wrong. As he radioed in his findings, that uneasy feeling in his gut twisted tighter. By 8:00 a.m., his instincts had set off a full-scale mobilization. The Teton Interagency Search and Rescue Team gathered at a makeshift command post not far from Jenny Lake. The morning air buzzed with tense coordination, gear clinking, radios crackling, the scent of pine and strong coffee thick in the air. At the center of the operation stood Lead Ranger Mike Connolly, steady under pressure. Before a massive topographic map pinned to a board, he briefed the teams. The Paintbrush Cascade Loop was marked in red, a 20-mile circuit winding through high elevations, exposed ridges, and dense alpine forests. "Our subject is Amelia Turner," he announced, age 24, highly experienced, solo hiker, well-equipped. She intended to camp near Holly Lake the first night. That's our primary focus. Teams were divided with military efficiency. Ground crews would begin hiking the loop from both directions. Canine units were dropped by helicopter into high elevation zones to search downward. An air crew was already circling the route in a search chopper, its blades thumping a steady, anxious rhythm into the clear mountain air. Shortly after noon, the first break came, and with it, the first chilling mystery. The ground crew, moving slowly up the steep, switchbacked trail of Paintbrush Canyon, spotted something in the trees. A small tent. Its green nylon fabric is barely distinguishable from the surrounding forest, but unmistakably man-made against the tapestry of fir and pine. It was Amy's tent. Tucked in a sheltered grove of evergreens only a short distance from Holly Lake, it sat exactly where her plan said it would be, but the scene struck the searchers with an eerie stillness. The tent was expertly pitched, its rainfly taut, stakes driven perfectly into the rocky soil. The zipper was closed. Inside, her sleeping pad was unrolled, and next to it lay her compact day pack, neatly placed, untouched. There were no signs of a struggle, no clutter, no overturned gear, just a pristine, silent camp, and no sign of Amy. Inside the small day pack left behind in Amy Turner's tent, searchers found only 3 items: an empty water bottle, a protein bar wrapper, and a nearly full tube of sunscreen. That was it. Her heavier Osprey backpack, the one that held her food, sleeping bag, extra clothing, first aid kit, and satellite communicator, was gone. Her hiking boots were missing too. It didn't add up. This wasn't a scene of panic or flight. Nothing was overturned. There were no signs of a struggle or haste. It was as if she had calmly packed her gear, laced up her boots, and walked out of camp, leaving behind the day pack that every seasoned hiker knows to keep close. To the rangers, it painted an inexplicable picture. You don't leave your day pack behind unless you're sure you're coming back, and you certainly don't carry your heaviest gear out of camp for a casual walk. The logic of backcountry travel had been quietly, but completely, upended. Ranger Mike Connolly stared at the tent for a long time before ordering the canine units to the site. It was time to bring in the dog that had cracked more lost hiker cases than anyone on the team. Kaiser, a seasoned German shepherd with an almost uncanny ability to read scent. Kaiser was led to the front flap of the tent. He sniffed, once, twice, then let out a low, mournful whine and took off up the hill, his handler sprinting to keep pace. But the trail he followed didn't stick to the designated hiking routes. Instead, it veered sharply into the brush, cutting across dense willows and unstable scree, rising sharply up a rugged slope no sensible hiker would choose. The team pressed on, struggling to stay upright as they climbed. The terrain was brutal, uneven, choked with deadfall, and increasingly remote. After about a half-mile of this grueling ascent, Kaiser reached a clearing formed by a massive tumble of granite boulders. The dog paused, sniffed wildly, circled, and then stopped. And sack. The trail ended. Not faded, not confused, it ended. Kaiser looked up at his handler, tail low, ears twitching. There was nowhere else to go. The scent simply vanished. The handler radioed back to base. "Scent terminates here," he reported. "It just stops. There's no exit trail, nothing to follow." It was as though Amy had vanished mid-step, lifted from the landscape by some invisible force. It defied both training and instinct. While the canine team processed the dead end, another group of rangers focused on tracking down the Ohio couple, Eleanor and Gerald, who had taken Amy's final photograph at the trailhead. They were located at a hotel in Jackson, just hours from flying home. Heartbroken by the news, they recounted their brief encounter in detail. Amy had been bright, excited, and incredibly present. But Eleanor suddenly remembered something else. "About 10 minutes after we left her," she said slowly, "we passed another hiker. A man, alone." Gerald nodded. He had this intense look about him. Military-style pack, old and worn. Didn't speak, didn't even glance at us. The man hadn't returned their greeting. His eyes had stayed fixed forward, his gait brisk and purposeful. There was nothing illegal or even suspicious about him. He could have been just another loner on the trail. But something about the memory unsettled them both. With no other leads, that vague description became a crucial focus. A forensic sketch artist worked with the couple to create a composite drawing. The result was a portrait of a man in his late 30s or early 40s, lean-faced, with hollow cheeks, deeply set eyes, and a grim, unreadable expression. That sketch quickly spread through ranger stations and local shelters, but there was no name to attach. No one else had seen him. No missing person reports matched. He became a ghost, an unsettling thread in a story already heavy with mystery. Witness or something darker? No one could say. Meanwhile, the helicopter team maintained its aerial grid sweeps. From above, the Tetons appeared as they always had. Sublime, majestic, and silent. The tree canopy in midsummer was thick and unbroken, a living shield that masked the forest floor. Deep canyons cut violently into the landscape, their shadowed crevices hiding every secret they chose not to give up. The pilot and spotters searched for the smallest sign, a glint of metal from a camera lens, the flash of color from a jacket, even the pattern of flattened grass. But the wilderness held tight. Amy's disappearance was now more than a mystery. It had become haunting. By day 5, morale began to slip. That morning, thick, low clouds began to roll in from the west. The sky turned the color of old bruises, deep gray, edged in purple. The air grew sharp with the metallic tang of incoming rain. Then the storm hit. It was brutal. Thunder rolled through the canyons, echoing like cannon blasts. Lightning webbed across the sky in fierce, jagged streaks. Torrents of cold rain pounded the forest, transforming dry earth into dangerous, slippery mudslides. For the safety of every crew member, the operation was suspended. No one could move safely through the mountains, and worse, everyone knew what the storm meant. The rain would erase everything. Any faint footprints Amy may have left were now obliterated. Any remaining scent trail would be washed into the earth. Evidence already scarce, was being drowned under inches of water. It was as though the Tetons themselves had chosen to bury the trail. 36 hours passed before the skies cleared. By then, the damage was done. After 10 days, the search effort had uncovered only a ghost trail to nowhere and a quiet campsite frozen in time. The rangers were exhausted. Volunteers were emotionally wrecked. Helicopter hours were maxed out. Resources, financial and human, were nearing their limit. At the 10th evening briefing, Mike Connolly stood before the group, his expression grim. The command post had grown quieter in recent days. Hope had thinned. He cleared his throat and delivered the words no one wanted to hear. We're shifting from active search to limited, continuous patrol. It was a sterile phrase, heavy with implication. The mission was no longer about rescue. It was about recovery, if that. Hope was no longer driving the effort. The procedure was. The tents came down, the radios were packed away, the volunteers embraced one another, some weeping openly. The forest was silent again. Amy's parents, who had maintained a near-constant presence nearby, were devastated. Her father, Mark, stood silently in the now empty briefing room, his gaze fixed on the giant map still hanging on the wall. Red marker lines traced the route his daughter had planned to hike. Dotted lines showed the flight paths of the search helicopters. Circles marked the search grids, each now closed out. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Everyone knew. The official search had ended. But for Mark Turner, his daughter's journey was not over. Not yet. The seasons shifted in the Tetons with a beauty that was as brutal as it was breathtaking. The electric greens of summer, once vibrant and full of life, bled slowly into the searing hues of fall. Fiery reds, burnt oranges, and golds so brilliant they seemed to light the aspen groves from within. For a few fleeting weeks the mountains burned with color, a final burst of life before surrendering to the silence of snow. Then, in early October, the palette changed again. The fire went out. The first snows came quietly, covering the peaks in pale white and veiling the trails in a hush that muffled sound and memory alike. The skies turned to slate, and the once boisterous wind grew solemn. Winter arrived not as an intruder, but as an ancient king reclaiming his throne. The silence it brought wasn't just a lack of sound. It was a presence, absolute and old as the stone itself. With that silence came a shift in how people remembered Amelia Turner. The urgency of her disappearance had dulled. The daily updates ceased. Her face, once plastered across bulletin boards and gas stations, faded. The missing person flyers, once bright with color and hope, began to curl at the edges in the dry mountain air, their colors bleached by the relentless high-altitude sun. Visitors passed them by with only a glance. At the Park Service headquarters, her case file sat thick with paperwork. Interview transcripts, search grids, equipment checklists, aerial photos, all neatly compiled, all utterly lifeless. It had grown heavier in weight, yet colder in spirit. Her name, once spoken with urgency and compassion, was now one of several in a somber ledger of the lost. People who entered the wild and never came back, souls who seemed to dissolve into the forest floor, leaving behind only mysteries and mourning. Locals in Jackson whispered her story to newcomers. Tour guides told it softly between tales of wildlife and geological wonder. It became a modern ghost story, the girl who vanished from Paintbrush Canyon. An artist, a solo hiker, a spirit of the mountains. It was cautionary folklore wrapped in a photograph and a pink tank top. But for Mark Turner, Amy's father, her story never became legend. It remained real, immediate, ongoing. Mark was not a man shaped by sentiment. He was a retired land surveyor, someone who had spent decades turning wilderness into coordinates. He had measured the world in feet and angles, not stories. But grief has a way of making even the most grounded man chase shadows. The idea that his daughter, a brilliant, stubborn, living light, could simply vanish from a place he could see, chart, and touch, it broke something fundamental in him. The official search had stopped, but Mark's mission had only begun. He sold off a small piece of land he'd been saving for his grandkids' inheritance and used the funds to sustain a deeply personal operation. Each weekend, he left his modest home in Salt Lake City and drove north to Wyoming. His old Ford F-150, now permanently packed with climbing gear, snowshoes, topo maps, and survival supplies, became a familiar fixture at trailheads and ranger stations. The rangers, some of whom had worked the original search, treated him with a quiet, painful respect. They brought him coffee, helped him update weather maps, and reminded him gently when storms rolled in. They didn't stop him. They knew better. This wasn't a man wandering blindly through grief. He had a purpose. Mark had transformed the wilderness into a personal grid system. He used high-resolution satellite imagery, geological surveys, and his own cartographic skills to create an intricate mosaic of the terrain. The official search had covered miles in sweeping passes. Mark went inch by inch, one drainage, one ravine, one cliffside at a time. He broke the land into bite-sized quadrants and searched each one methodically. If an area had been searched by helicopter, he walked it. If it had been walked, he would have crawled through it. He was looking for any anomaly, an unnatural depression in snow, a glint of metal, a thread of fabric out of place. He found nothing. But still, he returned. Because it was no longer about hope, it was about love, about bringing her home. While Mark moved through the quiet wilderness, a different kind of search exploded online. On forums devoted to unsolved mysteries, outdoor exploration, and true crime, Amy's story became a case study, a riddle, a lightning rod. Threads dedicated to her disappearance stretched into the thousands of comments. Everyone had a theory. The prevailing explanation, the one authorities gently supported, was the simplest. A misstep, a fall, a tragic but plausible accident. Amy had slipped, fallen into an unseen ravine, or landed in a patch of undergrowth so dense it swallowed her whole. Nature was vast. The possibilities are endless. But not everyone agreed. Some speculated she had been attacked by a wild animal, a grizzly, a mountain lion. But those who knew the back country pushed back. There were no signs, no torn gear, no blood, no drag marks, and Amy's campsite had been untouched. An attack would have left chaos. Instead, everything had been still, undisturbed. A darker theory began to take shape, one that questioned whether Amy had vanished by choice. Sleuths pored over excerpts from her journals, which her family had released in the hopes of sparking leads. In them, Amy had written about her growing disconnect from urban life, her craving for solitude, her belief in nature as the only place she felt truly herself. Some took these words as signs that she had orchestrated her own disappearance, that she had found a cabin, or walked deep enough into the woods to never return. But even that idea felt hollow to those who knew her. Amy didn't run away. She hiked to connect, not to vanish. And so, focus turned back to the man from the trail. The gaunt-faced hiker with the military pack, the one who didn't make eye contact, who didn't return a greeting, who moved with purpose but offered no humanity. The forums gave him a name, many names in fact. The Phantom, the Cascade Ghost, Teton John. He became a myth wrapped in speculation, a character in a growing digital campfire story. Was he a predator? A drifter? A figment of memory made monstrous by hindsight? No one could say. No other hikers recalled seeing him. No one stepped forward with a name. But the sketch lingered, and with no other suspects, he became the blank page onto which every worst fear was written. Mark kept searching. Winter turned to spring. Forums recycled the same arguments. Articles were written. Podcasts were recorded. The story of Amelia Turner refused to die. But it refused to resolve, too. In late August of 2024, more than a year after Amelia Turner vanished into the wilds of Grand Teton National Park, what seemed like a long-awaited breakthrough surfaced, not in a briefing room or a search grid, but in the icy waters of Cascade Creek. It was a clear morning when an experienced fly fisherman named Hugh Monroe decided to explore a remote section of the stream, several miles downstream from the original search zone. Navigating the slick stones with practiced ease, he noticed something catching sunlight beneath the rippling surface. Wedged tightly between two boulders, barely visible under the current, something metallic gleamed. Curious, he waded in, boots gripping against the rocky bottom, and reached down with gloved hands. What he pulled free was a single black trekking pole. Worn, its foam grip faded from use, and the carbon shaft scuffed in multiple places. The tip had visible scratches, and the brand logo was partially rubbed off. But Hugh recognized it instantly as a Lakey, a popular high-end model favored by serious backpackers. It had a professional feel, not the kind of gear casual hikers tend to carry. He stood in the stream holding the pole, and his mind flashed back to a poster he'd seen months ago in the visitor center. Amy Turner, the missing photographer. She had been holding poles just like this. Unsure but unnerved, he hiked back out and turned the item over to the Park Service, explaining exactly where he had found it. Within hours, the find sent a current of electricity through a case that had been dormant for too long. Rangers and investigators scrambled to assess the significance. It didn't take long to confirm. The trekking pole was indeed the same model Amy had been carrying in the widely circulated photo taken the morning she disappeared. Her parents were notified immediately. For a moment, their grief cracked just wide enough for hope to slip in. A specialized search team was dispatched to the stretch of Cascade Creek where the pole had been recovered. It was rough terrain, jagged, slippery, and difficult to traverse, but they combed the area meticulously, hearts pounding with renewed urgency. That hope, however, would not last. Hydrologists soon joined the effort, analyzing current patterns and watershed flow data. Their verdict was disheartening. In a mountain system as dynamic as the Tetons, particularly one fed by volatile spring runoff, the pole could have traveled from almost anywhere. A single heavy rain or snowmelt event could have carried it for miles, tumbling it down from unseen ridges or alpine cirques. In the end, it was a fragment, a ghost of Amy's last day. A physical echo, real but maddeningly imprecise. The location offered no answers, no direction. Only the certainty that she had once passed this way, and the haunting realization that her trail had again gone cold. Once more, the mountains had surrendered a single sliver of truth, only to tighten their grip on the rest. The summer of 2024 ripened into its full alpine bloom. Wildflowers exploded across meadows in a riot of color. Lupine, Indian paintbrush, glacier lilies. Marmots lounged in the sun, basking on slabs of warm granite. Above them, raptors rode invisible currents of air, their wings casting fleeting shadows on the ground below. Among them soared the golden eagles, apex hunters of the sky, whose presence often went unnoticed by visitors but was closely monitored by one particular ranger, David Chen. A 15-year veteran of the National Park Service, David was known for his quiet presence, steady hands, and encyclopedic knowledge of the region's ecosystems. While he fulfilled his park duties diligently, his heart belonged to birds. As one of the lead researchers on the golden eagle population in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, he spent his summers conducting detailed nesting surveys, solo, dangerous work that took him far from the trails into the remote, vertical wilderness few people ever saw. In late July, nearly 11 months since Amy had vanished, David was surveying a rugged basin known for its scree slopes and sheer rock faces. He moved with the practiced grace of a man who had spent decades climbing, his binoculars an extension of his body, always ready. Perched high on a narrow ridge, he glanced a distant cliff face, scanning for the signs of an established nest. Soon enough, he spotted it, a sprawling eyrie of tangled sticks, perched on a grassy ledge halfway up the cliff wall. A perfect eagle nest. Massive, wild, resilient. But something wasn't right. Amidst the earthy browns and weathered grays of the nest, there were flashes of unnatural color, bright red and vibrant turquoise. They didn't belong. His first thought was the usual frustration: trash. It wasn't uncommon for debris to be carried into the backcountry by careless visitors or powerful winds. But the colors stood out too vividly, too unnaturally for him to ignore. He radioed his position to dispatch, noting he'd attempt a retrieval for wildlife safety. Then he began the climb. The ascent was treacherous. Loose scree slid beneath his boots with every step, and he had to pause repeatedly to test holds and secure his balance. But he was used to these conditions. He'd climbed worse. Still, as he neared the ledge, a chill began to seep into his gut, an instinctive discomfort he couldn't name. The closer he got, the clearer the objects became. The red wasn't just a bag, and the turquoise wasn't rope. When he finally pulled himself onto the narrow ledge and stood before the nest, his breath caught. The nest was enormous, nearly 5 feet across, a fortress of branches and scavenged materials interwoven with a wild precision. But wedged among those branches were human items. The turquoise scrap was unmistakably part of a nylon gear sack, shredded and frayed. Nearby, more ominously, was a pair of women's underwear, tattered, dirty, and unmistakable. Mostly white, but with crimson trim around the waistband and leg holes. The color had faded, but not enough to erase recognition. In that moment, David Chen froze. His mind flashed to the photos, the briefings, the case that had haunted every ranger since last summer. Amy Turner, the young photographer, the girl with the blue pack and red-strapped gear. His legs felt heavy, his stomach turned. He stepped back slowly, careful not to disturb anything. This was no longer trash. This was evidence. This was a cry from the silence. The wilderness had spoken again, just a whisper, a flicker, but enough to raise the hairs on the back of his neck. Enough to know that the void was no longer empty. With trembling hands, Ranger David Chen pulled out his service phone. The urgency of the moment had completely overtaken his usual calm. Carefully, he began taking photographs of the eagle's nest and its strange contents, capturing every angle, every incongruous thread of fabric. He knew better than to touch anything. This wasn't just litter anymore. This was potentially the break in a case that had haunted the Tetons for nearly a year. His voice, normally measured and composed, cracked with urgency as he radioed in. "Dispatch, this is Chen," he said, his breath still labored from the climb. "I'm at the nesting site in the upper basin. I may have found something related to the Turner case." The words echoed through the radio and into the ranger station with the force of a lightning strike. After months of stagnant silence, the cold case, once thought buried by time and wilderness, was suddenly, shockingly alive. By the time David made it back to base, the evidence had been bagged and tagged according to protocol. Still in his field gear, he stood by silently as the items were laid out on a sterile cloth in the investigation room. The mood shifted as soon as the objects were examined under fluorescent light. There, beside a high-resolution printout of the last known photograph of Amelia Turner, lay the soiled, weathered pair of women's underwear. The red trim on the waistband was a startling match to the color accents on Amy's Osprey pack straps. Visible in the image, she had posed for just moments before her fateful hike. A deep, unsettling silence settled over the room. Seasoned investigators, men and women hardened by years of experience, exchanged glances but said nothing. The implications were forming in their minds long before the words were spoken. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was a message brought back from the brink of the unknowable. A grim biological theory began to take shape, one that aligned with both the discovery and the terrain. Golden eagles, while majestic predators, were also opportunistic scavengers. They didn't just hunt. They fed on carrion. They were drawn to the scent of blood and decay. The scenario, as disturbing as it was plausible, became clear. An eagle, soaring high above the basin, had been attracted to something below, possibly Amy's body or items of clothing soaked in blood. It had landed, scavenged, and taken a scrap of fabric to fortify its nest. It was horrific, and it made a brutal kind of sense. This discovery shifted everything. It suggested Amy hadn't simply slipped and vanished into the vast unknown. Her remains were likely nearby, somewhere on that same brutal, unfrequented slope. The scope of the mystery had been narrowed. The impossible vastness of the Teton Range had contracted into a single hillside, a zone now marked by scientific precision and quiet dread. The Park Service authorized a new search effort immediately, but this time the tone was different. There would be no lost hiker alerts, no press conferences begging for information. This wasn't a rescue mission anymore. This was recovery. A specialized team was assembled within hours. Forensic anthropologists from the University of Wyoming, accustomed to reading stories in bones and burial patterns, flew in. They were joined by cadaver dog units from across the region, as well as elite members of Teton County's high-angle recovery team. Experts trained to operate in the kind of terrain most would never attempt to walk, let alone search. The team was airlifted by helicopter to a staging area in the basin below the Eagle's Nest. The sound of the rotors whipped the alpine meadow into a frenzy of wind and noise, an unnatural intrusion into a place of untouched silence. The air at that altitude was thin, but the atmosphere was thick with solemn purpose. Everyone understood where they were and what they were there to do. They had entered sacred ground, a place that had once been Amy's passion and had now become the presumed site of her final moments. The grid was small, just 1 square mile, but the terrain made it punishing. The hillside was a chaotic tangle of steep grassy pitches, shifting scree that moved like marbles underfoot, and jagged boulder fields cut with narrow chutes and deadfalls. The team moved with slow, surgical precision. Every inch of ground was examined, every anomaly noted. The dogs were tireless, their movements fluid and their noses working constantly. Their handlers issued quiet commands, careful not to disturb the stillness more than necessary. For 2 full days, the search yielded only silence. The sun burned down from above, wind scoured the ridgelines, the vastness mocked their efforts. But on the morning of the 3rd day, hope returned in the form of a black Labrador named Odin. Near a tangle of thorny brush and wind-stunted fir trees at the base of a boulder cluster, Odin stopped. He whined, his body tense. Then he began pawing at the ground. His handler froze. This was a definitive alert, a signal Odin had found something. The team converged quietly. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Alana Rios knelt to inspect the spot. To the untrained eye, it looked like any other patch of mountain soil, rocks, roots, and loose dirt. But she saw it immediately. A subtle depression, just unnatural enough to raise alarm. Stones stacked in a way no landslide would create. She pointed to the center. "Start here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. With trowels and brushes, the team began removing soil 1 layer at a time. The work was slow and respectful. Every movement was calculated. Every fragment is preserved. After about an hour, one of the searchers paused. His tool had scraped against something. It wasn't stone. It was soft, but not earth. He carefully brushed the dirt away. A piece of blue fabric emerged, the sleeve of a technical hiking shirt. Just a few inches away, another shape took form. Pale, curved, unmistakable. A human bone. There was no outburst, no cry of discovery, just a deep, collective silence as the team recognized what they had found. Over the next several hours, a shallow grave was revealed, just under 2 feet deep. It had been hidden beneath rocks and soil, camouflaged by the surrounding wilderness. Inside lay the skeletal remains of a human body. Documentation began immediately. Every detail was photographed, every bone and fabric scrap logged. The body was then carefully extracted, bagged, and airlifted to the county morgue under escort. Within 24 hours, dental records confirmed the truth. The body was that of Amelia Turner. The remains were conclusively identified as those of Amelia Turner. When the news reached her parents, it landed with a cruel complexity, an unbearable confirmation, yet also a strange form of closure. For more than a year they had existed in a purgatory of not knowing. Now they knew. Their daughter was no longer missing. She was gone. The agony of the revelation was softened only by the faintest breath of relief. Relief that she hadn't simply vanished forever into the folds of the mountain. Relief that she was no longer a question mark suspended between timelines. They could bring her home. But the peace that came with answers was short-lived. The autopsy conducted by forensic anthropologist Dr. Alana Rios uncovered a far darker truth than any of them had prepared for. It wasn't a tragic hiking accident. It wasn't a fall. It wasn't exposure. The injuries told a different story, one marked not by nature, but by violence. There were multiple fractures to Amy's bones, including one to her skull that was unmistakably the result of blunt force trauma. It wasn't a tumble over rocks or a misstep off a ledge. The pattern, clean and deliberate, indicated she had been struck. Hard. Deliberately. More than once. But that was only the beginning. Trace evidence recovered with her remains, and later confirmed through advanced forensic testing, revealed the most unthinkable violation. Amelia Turner had been sexually assaulted before her death. The finding tore through the team with a sickening finality. This was no longer an accident, no longer a mystery of the wilderness. It was a homicide. The case file, already thick with reports and theories, was immediately reclassified. Everything shifted. Investigators, park officials, even the rangers who had scoured the landscape for her were forced to revisit every detail with new eyes. No longer searching for misadventure, but for malice. The only potential lead they had ever truly possessed, the vague description of the intense hiker spotted near Amy on the morning of her disappearance, was suddenly catapulted from footnote to focal point. The composite sketch, once a shot in the dark, became their best and only suspect profile. The drawing was re-released to the public, this time not as a call for assistance from a potential witness, but as a manhunt for a murderer. Local media in Jackson, national news outlets, and even the true crime forums that had long followed Amy's case all exploded with the update. The mystery that had fascinated and haunted thousands had transformed into a very real nightmare. Tangible, targeted, and human. The break came from an unexpected place. Brenda Evans, a middle-aged woman working the front desk at a budget motel in Pinedale, Wyoming, just over an hour south of Jackson, was watching the evening news when the sketch flashed across the screen. The image struck her like a punch to the gut. The hollow eyes, the grim mouth, the gaunt cheeks. She had seen that man, she was sure of it. Without hesitation, Brenda called the Teton County Sheriff's tip line. She explained that the man in the sketch had stayed at her motel the previous summer. He had checked in under the name Robert Frazier and paid in cash, week to week. He had said little, kept to himself, and claimed he was working in seasonal construction. But what made her hair stand on end was something else. He had abruptly checked out just a few days after the first missing person reports about Amy had circulated through the region. Armed with a name and timeline, the multi-agency task force sprang into action. They quickly built a profile. Robert Bob Frazier, 42 years old, was a drifter. Transient by lifestyle, ghost-like in his digital presence. A sealed juvenile record hinted at a violent history, and adult life had seen him drifting across western states, taking under-the-table jobs in construction and ranch work, never staying anywhere long enough to plant roots. Cross-referencing labor records and following up with employment agencies, investigators tracked his recent movements. The trail led to Montana. Frazier was working as a ranch hand on a large, isolated property outside of Billings. With a search warrant in hand, a tactical team made up of FBI agents and local deputies descended on the ranch at dawn. Frazier was caught completely off guard. He offered no resistance, no reaction, just a flat, unreadable stare. His arrest was clean, but what they found afterward was anything but. In a dust-covered shed near the back of the property, among rusted tools and old feed bins, they discovered a heavy military/steel footlocker secured with a thick padlock. They forced it open. Inside was a predator's trove. There were driver's licenses belonging to 3 different women, a collection of small, personal jewelry pieces, bundled locks of hair, handwritten notes. And at the bottom, wrapped in an old stained T-shirt, was a Nikon D750 camera. Investigators checked the serial number. It was Amy's. That alone would have been damning, but it was the camera's memory card that sealed Frazier's fate. At the FBI's Regional Forensics Lab, tech specialists recovered the files. The first images were Amy's stunning, intimate photos of the Tetons from her final hike. Alpine meadows, painted skies, towering peaks, beauty captured forever. Then came the horror. The next series of photographs was taken not by Amy but by Frazier. The sequence told a story far more chilling than any written confession. The first image was distant. Amy hiking, unaware she was being watched. Then came a closer one, and closer still. The camera followed her, stalked her. The final images were unspeakable. They documented the assault in clinical, nightmarish clarity. Amy's terrified face, her resistance, her final moments. The images stripped away the last trace of doubt. They were pure evil, cold, meticulous, a window into the mind of a monster. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit interrogation room, Robert Fraser sat motionless. Two seasoned investigators, one from the FBI, one from the Teton County Sheriff's Office, grilled him for hours. He said nothing. Not a word. His face was unreadable, an impassive wall of denial. He was confident, he believed that without a confession he could not be convicted. The breakthrough came not from questions, but from silence. The FBI agent entered the room holding a plain manila folder. He didn't say a word. He sat down across from Fraser and began to remove photographs one by one and lay them on the table. The first was Amy's landscapes. Then, the first shot was taken by Fraser. Amy is in the distance, unaware, innocent. Fraser's face changed. Not much, but enough. The mask cracked, and the truth began to pour out. The next photograph brought Fraser's shadow closer. Another followed, each frame pulling him in from the periphery like a predator closing in on its prey. The investigators laid the images out in a grim sequence, constructing a wordless indictment, an escalating storyboard that told the truth without uttering a single word. The final images were acts of violence committed in silence, clinical in composition, brutal in content. They were laid before Fraser like a silent jury, and each photograph shouted with the undeniable voice of guilt. As the glossy prints slid into place on the metal interrogation table, Fraser's eyes followed them. He said nothing. But something in his posture changed, an almost imperceptible shift, the rigidity in his spine giving way to an involuntary slump of resignation. His denials, so firm, so automatic, simply stopped. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating stillness. According to the official transcript, Fraser didn't speak for 7 minutes. 7 agonizing minutes, where the only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights and the low whisper of the ventilation system. His eyes never left the images. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. He stared, not with guilt, but with a dead-eyed acceptance. The investigators didn't press him. They didn't speak. They waited, letting the weight of the evidence, the faces, the colors, the cold brutality, bear down on him like gravity. Finally, his voice broke the silence, low, even, devoid of emotion. "That's me," he said quietly, nodding at a photograph of Amy in profile, unaware she was being watched. It was not a confession. It was a simple acknowledgement of fact, but it cracked open the floodgate. Without prompting, Fraser began to speak. Not with remorse, not with apology, but with the calm detachment of someone recounting a memory devoid of emotional relevance. He described seeing Amy that morning, watching her as she adjusted her pack, her movements so precise. Something about her captivated him. Not her vulnerability, but her confidence. It was, he said, an invitation. He followed her at a distance for hours, staying just out of sight. His movements, he claimed, were practiced. He had done this before. He watched her set up her camp near Holly Lake, watched her cook, watched her read from a small notebook, watched as she stepped away from the campsite with a water filter in hand, walking toward the nearby stream. That's when he struck. With clinical precision, he described the ambush. He approached from behind, how she thought, harder than he'd expected. He admitted he hadn't planned to kill her initially, but her resistance changed the equation. He struck her with a rock, once, then again. His voice didn't waver. He described the act as though it were a mechanical process, like describing how to build a fire or pitch a tent. Then he told them how he dragged her body into the brush, dug a shallow grave, and covered her with soil and rocks. He took her camera and left. When asked why he did it, why Amy, his answer was devoid of humanity. She shouldn't have been out there alone. No remorse, no empathy, just a monstrous logic born from years of entitlement and predation. As the interrogation continued, Frazier unpooled a string of confessions, details that tied him to other disappearances, other women. 2 cold cases from the Rocky Mountain region. Similar methods, similar targets. Women who hiked alone, confident and free, vanishing without a trace. The ghost who had haunted the Tetons now had a name. And a face. And a long, horrifying trail of victims. The trial of Robert Frazier was swift but heavy with emotion. Prosecutors, armed with Amy's camera and Frazier's own confession, built a case so unyielding that the defense barely contested the charges. The courtroom in Jackson overflowed with press, law enforcement, and the families of the other victims, who now had answers. Mark and Sarah Turner sat in the front row every day. Their faces, pale and drawn, carried the weight of a grief that no verdict could lift. They listened as the prosecution read aloud transcripts of Frazier's confessions, as expert witnesses described the last moments of their daughter's life. They sat through every image, every statement, holding each other's hands, their fingers trembling but locked together in unity. The jury needed just 6 hours of deliberation. Frazier was found guilty on all counts: kidnapping, aggravated sexual assault, and first-degree murder. The judge, his voice steady but edged with fury, handed down the harshest sentence possible: life imprisonment without parole. "You used our wilderness as a weapon," the judge said, "but you will never walk free again." Frazier showed no reaction. His expression never changed. The man who had stalked the peaks like a phantom would now die behind bars, his world reduced to steel bars and concrete walls. But the consequences of his actions echoed far beyond the Tetons. In the days following his conviction, forensic teams combed through the contents of his trophy box, the battered footlocker retrieved from the ranch. Inside, they found items that connected him to other missing persons cases across the West. A Colorado woman named Jenna Hargrove, a college student from Idaho named Vanessa Lynn. Both had disappeared under circumstances eerily similar to Amy's. Frazier's confessions, corroborated by physical evidence, allowed investigators to locate the remains of both women. Their families, like the Turners, were finally able to lay their loved ones to rest after years of anguish and uncertainty. The relief was real, but it came at the cruelest cost. In the aftermath, the landscape of backcountry safety changed. New warnings were posted, trailheads added check-in stations, GPS tracking requirements were considered. The romantic vision of solo trekking through the mountains was now shadowed by a harder truth. Monsters, too, walked the trails. For Mark and Sarah Turner, the verdict brought a bittersweet justice. The man who took their daughter's life would never walk free again, but no amount of punishment could return Amy. The pain remained, a hollow place that no words could fill. They brought Amy home to Salt Lake City, her remains carried back with reverence. But they didn't bury her right away. They waited until spring, until the snow had melted from the high country and the wildflowers returned. Amy's memorial service was held not in a church, but in the park she had loved, on a high bluff overlooking the cathedral group, the peaks that had framed her final sunrise. Friends came from across the country. Rangers stood in uniform. Photographers she had inspired shared her work. Her images were projected onto a canvas suspended between trees, landscapes, animals, light and shadow, her final vision made immortal. Mark spoke last. His voice didn't shake. It rang with clarity and quiet pride. "I was told again and again that it was hopeless, that I should let go, that the mountains had taken her. But I knew Amy. I knew she wouldn't want to disappear. She would want to be found. And I made her that promise." He looked out over the crowd, his face illuminated by the setting sun. "I kept it." And with that, they said goodbye. Amy was laid to rest with a view of the Tetons she had loved so deeply. Her story, no longer a question mark in the wind, but a legacy of strength, of beauty, and of a light that not even the darkest night could fully extinguish. The case of Amelia Turner left more than just sorrow in its wake. It left a lasting fracture in the heart of a town, and a solemn imprint on the spirit of wilderness adventurers everywhere. In Jackson, where the community had once embraced the mountains as a sanctuary, Amy's fate cast a chilling pall over every trailhead and overlook. Her story shattered the illusion that skill and preparation alone could safeguard a soul from harm. It reminded everyone that danger doesn't always announce itself with thunder or claws. Sometimes it walks silently on 2 feet, blending seamlessly into the landscape, carrying darkness beneath a weathered pack and quiet demeanor. Though the peaks of the Tetons still glow golden in morning light, and the alpine meadows bloom in summer's full glory, there is an invisible weight in the air for those who remember. A stillness that whispers of a young woman with a camera, a dream, and a heart full of courage who never came home. For them, the wilderness remains breathtaking. But now it also breathes a quiet warning. Not every shadow in the forest belongs to the tree. Amelia Turner is no longer just a memory. She is a lesson carved into the stone bones of the Tetons.